Welcome everyone, Costin here with some of the most boring campaigns in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. You can consider this as a sort of a sequel, quote-unquote, to my video on the worst campaigns in the game, which included things like Cetra, Arkhan, Greasus, and so on. But when we're talking about boring campaigns, one has to understand that it's not about the power of a legendary lord necessarily. Just because a legendary lord has a lot of power doesn't mean their campaign is good, and similarly, if a legendary lord is weak, doesn't mean that their campaigns are going to be bad. In fact, there are some weak legendary lords in this game, or some weak races that can have really fun campaigns, as opposed to some really powerful legendary lords that can have very boring campaigns. As an example, Arkhan is the most powerful legendary lord flat out in the game. The reason he's so powerful is not because his race is powerful, though it is. It's also because his campaign is dreadfully boring. Powerful, you'll steamroll the map in a way that only the greenskins can match, and even then, you have one advantage over the greenskins. You can do it while AFK, because you can gain so many vassals, and the vassals will do the fighting for you, and you get significant benefits for those vassals as they stand. He also has a really powerful army that scales up the more they level up. So Arkhan's campaign is just not really a fun campaign. Though it's not just purely because it's powerful, it's also because of the way it's designed. For instance, someone like Kolic can have a really fun campaign as opposed to Arkhan, because Kolic actually has some level of challenge to it. He does have some interesting choices to make. Whereas with Arkhan, not quite as much. You just steamroll everyone, you get those vassals, and nothing interesting necessarily happens for the rest of the campaign. So that's what I want to talk about here. Those kind of campaigns where it's just really boring from beginning to end, or boring in critical portions of the campaign. Now to kick it off, and these campaigns are in no particular order on this list, but to kick it off, it's Arkhan the Black. Now, Arkhan doesn't have one of the worst campaigns, but he certainly has a very boring campaign currently in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. The reason behind this is because Arkhan is ridiculously powerful. He's got everything that the Tomb Kings could want: a good start position, a powerful army, and extra army capacity. See, the problem with the Tomb Kings early on in their campaigns is that they struggle because of two factors. One is army capacity. Most Tomb Kings, legendary lords with the exception of Arkhan, can only recruit one army from the start of their campaign. And they need research, or a Book of Nagash, or the Mortuary Cult in order to increase their army capacity. So the early game can be a bit harrowing. Now for all of them, Khalida and Katep are pretty decent. Cetra is in a really bad spot. But then comes Arkhan. And Arkhan starts with an extra army capacity from the very start of his campaign. That means he can just, from the turn 1, he can just start recruiting some extra units. The second thing about the Tomb Kings is their unit capacity situation. In order for them to have a powerful army, they need to get structures to increase their unit capacity. You won't be running around with armies made up purely of Tomb Guard from turn 1. You have to gain a significant amount of territory for that in order to be able to do it. But Arkhan has a solution to that particular problem as well. Arkhan starts with one of the Books of Nagash, and this particular Book of Nagash gives you the ability to recruit certain Vampire Counts units from a structure that is absolutely ridiculous in terms of what it offers. So this structure will give you 4 Crypt Ghouls, 4 Dire Wolves, 4 Fellbats. Now, the Fellbats themselves as units are not good units, really, but they're certainly better than the carrion that the Tomb Kings would generally use. But the Dire Wolves and the Crypt Ghouls, they're pretty decent units. Generally speaking, you wouldn't necessarily use Dire Wolves if you're playing a Vampire count, because they can be a bit too expensive to maintain upkeep-wise, even if they're decent units. Now, here's the thing, though. It's not like Arkhan gets vanilla versions of these units. No. See, Arkhan also gets upgrades to those particular units through his skill line. Like he gets melee attack, charge bonus for Dire Wolves and Hex Wraiths, melee attack for Fellbats and Crypt Ghouls. He also gets recruit rank for Fellbats, Dire Wolves, and Crypt Ghouls. So he gets them significantly more powerful in his campaign than the regular Vampire Count units. And that means that these units are pretty effective. Now granted, something like a Tomb Guard Doomstack will generally do better than anything Arkhan can put together. But what this allows Arkhan to do the extra army capacity, these units that he can recruit, the sheer capacity that he starts with. Like, I think if this structure didn't give you 4 at level 1, and at level 3 it only gives you 1 capacity of Hex Wraiths, I think if this structure was halved, the situation would be a bit better. But Arkhan is just going to be able to steamroll. He could take any starting position in the game and no one would be able to beat him, because he's just going to be able to very quickly, very effectively build up 2 powerful armies in his campaign. Every settlement can give him 4 capacity to direwolves, crypt ghouls, and felbats, and all of those units are better than the skeletal warriors or skeletal warriors with spearmen or skeletal spearmen that, generally speaking, the Tomb Kings have to deal with, outside of, you know, getting the barracks chain, getting Tomb Guard, or getting Shopkeep. But then there's a third factor here as well that helps ruin this campaign: his start position. See, Arkhan has one of the best starting positions in the game. He starts over here in the Wizard Caliph Palace in the Land of Assassins in Araby, which is one of the best, if not the best, start position in the entire game. For a simple reason: it's very safe, it's got free regions, it can generate a lot of economy, all that. Yes, it kind of sucks that it has 2 harbors, because you could really use those building slots for other things, but it's an incredibly good starting position for any faction. Any faction that would start here would be in a really advantageous space. In fact, this is such a good starting position that for my Ikeclaw campaign guide, I've made the point that one of the things you should do when playing as Ikeclaw should be to take the Land of Assassins. You also have the Great Desert of Araby, which isn't too important for the Tomb Kings, but here's an interesting tidbit: you can trade the Great Desert of Araby and vassalize other factions, like vassalize these dwarves, vassalize Rapans if you so desire. Though generally speaking, I would probably wipe out Rapans because the territory she has in the coast of Araby can be useful. But you can vassalize the dwarves over here if you so desire. Sure, they have an aversion against you, but the Great Desert is so powerful. So Arkhan has everything that you can imagine in a good campaign. He has a good start position, he has a good army, he has a weak foe to deal with. Like turn 1, well, all he does is he goes and wipes out these guys, their bloody province, from the very start of his campaign. He isn't as strong late game as, say, for instance, Cetra or even Khalida, but it doesn't matter how strong one is in the very late game, because what really matters in the vast majority of campaigns is how good you are in the early game. And Arkhan just demolishes the early game. Now, this campaign, I guess you could consider it fun if you just enjoy steamrolling everyone, but I think that the campaign where you're not really facing any serious opposition, where you're just wiping the floor with all of your opponents, and you have that capacity. Because here's the thing, Rapans doesn't have a great army, and she has a bit of a difficult campaign situation because she does have a powerful army over here on the vampire counts to deal with. So you can easily wipe out Rapans when you're playing as Arkhan the Black, or you could even vassalize her. You can vassalize the dwarves, like take out Baron Tegan over there, then deal with Rapans. And then you're unstoppable. Cetra, Volkmar, Manfred won't really stop you. I mean, you can have good diplomatic relations with Manfred, but typically speaking, it's actually better to wipe him out because you need that territory that he has. You want Kasabar, you want Bagar, you want Antok for yourself. The only limitations of this campaign are in the long term, but you can take over the wasteland, for instance. You can take over the entirety of the Badlands. You can't take over mountainous regions, but you can at least take over the Badlands, which gives you a lot of campaign flexibility. The only limitation in this campaign, this is also another thing that's bad about this campaign. See, another thing that's bad is the long-term prospects, because a lot of terrain is not suitable for Tomb Kings. This is an issue that Cetra also has, though he also has a really horrible early game. Like, you have the contrast between Cetra and Arkhan. Cetra has an early game that's brutally difficult, but then an easy late game. Arkhan has a very easy early game, but a more difficult late game, but it's not difficult in a good way. It's not like it's an actual challenge, because as the Tomb Kings, once you get going, once you build a powerful empire, no one's going to be able to stop you, because having free unit recruitment and free armies is an incredible strength. And another thing to mention about the Tomb Kings is their lords cannot die. All their lords can do is get wounded. So if you lose an entire army, yeah, you might lose the recruit ranks on that army. You might lose the heroes, which can die until you get Immortal on them. But you're not losing the guy leading it. And the units you lost, they're not going to hurt your economy in any way, shape, or form. So you can easily recover from that kind of situation. And as Arkhan, you will always have very powerful armies to unleash on your opponents. You also have a benefit with research as Arkhan because you can wait with researching the dynasty. So this campaign, yeah, if you just want to steamroll the game as the Tomb Kings, absolutely. If you're tired of the limitations of armies as the Tomb Kings, absolutely it can offer some things, but I find it dreadfully boring as it currently stands in the game. Second campaign for me to talk about in this video is Imrik's campaign for the High Elves. Imrik has always had a pretty bad campaign in Total War Warhammer ever since he was introduced in Warhammer 2. Immortal Empires specifically, and now in Immortal Empires. So I would certainly say his Immortal Empires campaign is better than Warhammer 2. It's less difficult for one, but it's still a pretty dreadful and boring experience in a lot of ways. See, Imrik's problem is that he starts isolated. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be an issue for a race like the Greenskins or a race like the Skaven. But for the High Elves, this is a major issue because a lot of your economy is dependent on trade. Like, for instance, your main economic building, the Elven Craftsman, relies on you trading with factions so you can sell those Elven trinkets. That's how you get a lot of money as the High Elves. Being isolated over here in the Plane of Bones means that you're going to have a difficult time setting up trade, which means your economy is going to be slower. Now, this doesn't necessarily make this campaign difficult. Imrik has a lot of power in his campaign, but the issue is how that power works. See, Imrik has a great deal of value in battle. The reason he has a lot of value is because he has pretty good stats and he gets a freaking dragon. He's also practically unkillable in a lot of battles. He does get the benefit to nobles, all that kind of good stuff. The issue is, though, in this campaign, you'll be fighting a lot of battles on your own, manually, against legendary lords that aren't necessarily so easy to deal with. So to the east you have Helman Ghorst over here, to the west you have Queek, and then Skarbrand and Malagor. To the north you have Tretch. Well, Tretch is not really a threat, but he's still an annoying thing to deal with. And then you have Grimgor to tackle in this particular campaign. Might sound fun playing a lot of these battles, but the reality of this campaign is that you end up having to fight a lot of battles manually, which is not really a fun experience in any particular campaign when you have to fight a lot of battles manually. The reason is that there's a lot of battles in every campaign that just aren't really fun to play. A lot of garrison battles, a lot of like minor settlement battles that you have to deal with, a lot of minor armies. But as Imrik, you're in that kind of situation where you want to fight these battles, at least until you can get the nobles and get some replenishment going. But even then, you're likely going to end up having to fight a lot of battles manually, winning them. And they're not going to be great battles. That's one of the big issues. On top of that, because your economy is limited, you're limited in how fast you can expand, how powerful you can get, how quick you can do the campaign. So you're going to be spending a lot of dead time when you're playing this campaign, which again is not really a fun experience, and nor is dealing with this kind of starting situation. I mean, especially the Broken Teeth situation where you have a tier 5, where no one can really take this entire province, but Queek will certainly take the Desolation of the Gash. The issue is the capital here is held by a really powerful Skaven army that's not that's not easy to take down. So you're in a situation where expanding here is an issue. You do have some advantages in this campaign, but it's not a great starting situation. It is a powerful race. It is a powerful army that Imrik does have access to, but it is a pretty miserable campaign. It's even worse because of the Confederation with Calidor mechanic that kicks off on turn 2. So in order to confederate Calidor, you need to occupy, loot, or sack 6 different settlements. In theory, you can cheese it to do it faster, and you want to do it faster. Like, this is how a campaign can be pretty damn broken. So Calidor, which you want to get access to in order to be able to trade with Tyrion and the other High Elves, is going to be under threat by Noctilus. So if you're playing on Legendary, they can fall very, very quickly, so you don't have time to waste. That pushes you as a player towards a really boring and bad playstyle, where what you do is, let's say you build an army on turn 1, and this is the best this is the best thing you can do, really. Let's just use this as an example. You start building a second army on turn 1, you start doing global recruitment with that particular army, or in this case really just local recruitment. That will do just fine. Imrik goes here, he doesn't take the settlement, he doesn't sack it. You wait until turn 2, you defeat this army, you wait until turn 2. Then you sack it with Imrik. Then your army here will have to make its way to the Bone Gulch to take it over. That's going to count for 2, and you have to do this with a couple of settlements like Ash Ridge Mountains, Darkhold potentially, maybe Rune's End and all that. Or Bitter Bay. Just occupy Bitter Bay. Is certainly a very frustrating start, and it doesn't necessarily get better. The only highlight of this particular campaign is that you get to deal with Grimgor eventually, which can certainly be a fun experience to deal with, and Imrik certainly has the power to deal with Grimgor. But outside of dealing with Grimgor in this campaign, the rest of the foes, the rest of the issues you're going to be dealing with, they're just not really that fun to tackle. Traversing this entire terrain to begin with, when you don't have when you can't use the underway, is generally speaking a pretty miserable experience, even more so when you're going to be limited early on in your campaign by the number of armies that you can field. So you're going to be wasting a lot of time. So you're going to have, as I said, a lot of dead time that doesn't lead for an interesting campaign experience from my perspective. Now, the third campaign I want to talk about here in this video is Count Noctilus for the Vampire Coast. He's not as bad as Silostra because of her starting position, but he still is in a rough state. The issues are really with the Vampire Coast more so necessarily than with Noctilus himself as a legendary lord. So the Vampire Coast is a really bad faction, probably the worst faction or one of the worst factions currently in the game. Now, it's not an economic issue, it's not an issue necessarily with their lords, it's an issue with their army roster in particular. So here's the problem that exists currently for the Vampire Coast as it currently stands. And for Noctilus in particular, because Noctilus' focus is to buff Necrofix Colossi and to move around the seas. Like if we look at his skill tree, it's pretty decent, of course, and he does get some benefits to Depth Guard, which are all very welcome, but his main campaign benefit is to be able to recruit Necrofix Colossi quicker, which can take a bit otherwise. But Necrofix Colossi are not really great units. And another thing to mention about him is he gets some upkeep of minus 20% for Necrofix Colossi. And a plus 15% weapon strength for large units, which includes them as well. Now, what's the issue with the Vampire Coast at the moment? Not an economic issue, not a settlement issue. The issue is with their army. And what's the problem with their army? Well, there are quite a few issues with their army. It's not one issue, it's multiple issues. So, stat-wise, the vast majority of units in the Vampire Coast roster are units that have weak leadership and weak armor. And there's also a lot of gunpowder units. So, gunpowder units with weak leadership, weak armor. There are some exceptions, of course, like the Mongols, the Sirens can be pretty decent because, yes, they have 0 armor, but obviously they're spectral units, so they do have that going for them. But here's the problem with all of this. So having weak leadership and weak armor means that you'll get shredded in any auto-resolve situation. And this is not just for the early game units either. No, this is for the majority of your roster, with some exceptions like Rotting Promethean Gunnery Mob has pretty high armor, but everything else like deck droppers, for instance, deck droppers with handguns, all that kind of stuff. Like your main army roster is really weak. Like deck gunners, really weak in terms of armor and leadership. So the auto-resolve is going to screw you over, which means that you're going to have to fight a lot of battles manually. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, you have weak armored units. The leadership issue, that's a different discussion, of course. But the leadership issue, of course, means that these units will crumble into dust very, very quickly, and you might lose a significant portion of your army if you're not careful very, very quickly. That's the problem with leadership. The problem with armor is any ranged army will tear you to shreds when you're playing a range-centric faction. That's how bad this is. You're playing a ranged-centric faction, or rather a faction focused on ranged units and monstrous units, and any other range faction, any other, in the entire game will tear you to shreds. Now, it doesn't help that you start near Wolf 1 at war with Kalidor, because guess what? Wolf 1 has a significant amount of range units and some of the best in the game. So, fighting a campaign in Wolf 1, which you don't have to do, but you do start that war with Kalidor. Maybe your best bet would be to take Kalidor. You can certainly do that quickly enough and then just get the hell out of here. Or maybe wipe out Tyrion quickly and then just get the hell out of here. Let Nakari and the Dark Elves deal with the situation. But a campaign against any kind of range faction is going to be a pretty miserable experience. Now, thankfully, you do start close enough to Lustria that you can just decide, you know what, I'm not going to be dealing with this. I'm just going to go to Lustria, I'm going to wipe out the minor Imperial factions there, take over Lustria, make it my territory. That is an option. But you'll still be dealing with a horrible situation in Otrozov. Then there's another problem. Gunpowder units. Now, the problem with gunpowder units is they don't really work very well in Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. When I say they don't work well, I mean that you can literally put them on an open field battle with the most straight lines imaginable, the perfect battlefield for gunpowder units, and they won't shoot many times. Another problem is in settlements. Guess what? You still have a lot of siege battles. You might not have a lot of minor settlement battles, thank God for that, but you still have a lot of siege battles to deal with in a campaign, especially in an area that might have a lot of provinces. And you do start next to them. Like, you do have that kind of situation in Lustria, you do have that kind of situation in Wolf 1. And gunpowder units are especially broken in siege battles. Like, if you put them, like, let's say you're in a settlement and you put them on flat terrain in a settlement battle, like in a siege battle, they won't fire. Let alone firing through broken walls or a broken gate or anything like that. So enjoy that. And on top of that, because your units have such low armor, if you do try and send them in to make use of your army, that army is going to get torn apart. The only saving grace for the Vampire Coast is, of course, their heroes. Like, if you focus on Morgonal Hunters and all the other heroes options that you have, and as well as potentially getting things like Depth Guard, Mortars, all that, you can have a really powerful army in your campaign that will not be stopped in any real battle, but it is a dreadful experience, I gotta say. Like, I've beaten an entire campaign. I've dealt with the endgame crisis and Noctilus, and I gotta say it was not a fun experience. The power of the army is not good. This faction really needs some major buffs. Probably won't get them because there's always the consideration of course, of multiplayer. But the Vampire Coast tends to do very well. Like, I never see any Vampire Coast faction doing very well in any of their campaigns. None of them succeed. Like, Sartosa tends to do the best, but that's because Sartosa has probably one of the best starting positions of all of them. And actually, Sartosa has some units that don't play like this, but I'll talk about Sartosa in a separate video. But suffice to say, like, outside of Sartosa, which even Sartosa gets wiped out by Belagar, of all people, like, with the exception of Sartosa, Silostra, Noctilus, Lufer, they all get wiped out relatively easily. Like, Lufer hangs on for a bit, but he does eventually get wiped out by the forces arrayed against him. Like, once the Lizardmen kick the Skaven out of Lustria, they're going to turn their attention towards him. Or the Lizardmen in Bretonnia are going to turn their attention. When you're losing to Bretonnia in a campaign, in an AI to AI battle, you're not exactly a great race. And so the Vampire Coast is a pretty bad race at the moment. Their only saving graces are their heroes and their lords. But lords and heroes do not make a faction, and that therein lies the problem. The only units that are really worth using, I would argue, are the Depth Guard, but they're pretty expensive to use, and they're tier 4 units. Getting access to tier 4 is not going to be so easy in any campaign you play. Certainly not for a Horde faction, or not for your Horde army, because of some of the limitations that do exist on growth. Because you might have a lot of growth, but it still will take a significant amount of time to, you know, get to tier 4, because you need a lot of these surplus points. I kind of think like this might need to be changed when it comes to the game. But yeah, there's a lot of issues with Vampire Coast, leads to dreadful campaigns. The people that suffer the most from that are Count Noctilus and Silostra. At least at Silostra, you have the option of quickly going to Bretonnia. As Noctilus, that's a bit further away. You can still do it if you want to have a better experience in your campaign. But the thing about it is that Sinnelleos can, you know, come over here in Northern Britannia. You're gonna come over here where you're gonna encounter Ikeclaw and Grom the Punch. Enjoy that particular campaign scenario. I mean, I guess you could see the ultimate battle of broken factions between the broken gunpowder units that Ikeclaw has versus your own broken gunpowder units. Here's the thing about Skaven though: their gunpowder units have very high armor. Your gunpowder units have squat. Now, the fourth faction to talk about on this list is Helman Ghorst. Bit of a shock, I imagine, for quite a few people, seeing as Helman Ghorst is one of the best legendary lords in the entire game. Easily one of the top 10, top 5 even, in the entire game. But here's the thing, that doesn't make his campaign good. It's not a great playstyle. In fact, it's a really boring playstyle. But let me talk about what makes Ghorst so amazing, and also how that makes them so really boring to play. So, Ghorst gets significant benefits to zombies. He gets a lot of casualty replenishment, poison attacks. For zombies as skeletal warriors, he gets lesser raised dead. For corpse cart and mortis engines, he gets a raised dead pull capacity of zombie units. You don't have global recruitment, you have the raising the dead mechanic as the vampire counts. And then Ghorst himself gets a lot of armor for zombies and critical units. And then he also gets melee attack, ward save, battle healing cap, and substantial benefits to zombies like 50% weapon strength. That makes zombies a lot more effective in battle. And if you're playing a campaign as Ghorst, it's what you want to do. You want to use the zombies because they're the most effective units you have in your entire campaign. And they're cheap as dirt as well. 93 to recruit, 19 to maintain. You can have some of the cheapest, most cost-effective armies in the entire freaking game. But, and there's the issue, playing with zombie armies in battle is exceptionally boring. Because zombies will take ages to kill anything. They have really horrible stats: weak melee attack, weak melee defense, weak weapon strength. So zombies are great line holders because they're very cheap, very cost effective, and as Ghorst, very good. But even with all the benefits that Ghorst gives them, they'll still be taking ages to kill anything. This might be one of the few campaigns in the game where what you want to do, if you're going to play it, what you want to do is set the time limit to unlimited for battles. Because if you're going to set it to 20 minutes, you're going to go over the 20-minute time limit in a lot of battles in this campaign. That's what makes this campaign so horrible. Because having a campaign where you have a lot of battles that you know you're going to win, but you have to fight them manually, is one of the most dreadful experiences that currently exists in the game. It's one of the most boring experiences. It's a really miserable experience to have in Warhammer 3. Now, this is an issue in general that the vampire factions, Coast and Counts, do have, that they, in their campaigns, especially with Coast, but also with Counts, that you may have to fight a lot of battles manually. But the worst offender of all of them is Ghorst, if you decide to actually play the best playstyle that he does have available, which is to, of course, get the truckload of zombies and just keep recruiting zombies, like never stop recruiting zombies, because you can have an army that might be 1,000 gold, and you can take armies that cost 3-4 times as much and win with relative ease, but you have to play that battle manually. And that's a really miserable experience. My advice to anyone that's deciding to play this faction, don't just go with zombies. You're going to regret your life choices if you do so. You still have access to the entire roster of the vampire count. So, yes, use Graveguard, use Blood Knights, use that. Like, have a couple of zombies as the line holders. Just throw them at the enemy so that the enemy can try and killing them. They won't. It would take a significant amount of power, and certainly none of the factions that surround Ghorst can actually kill the zombies very well. Certainly not the ogres on the Greases. But send the zombies to soak the damage. Doesn't matter if you lose all of them, you can easily replenish them. And then have like half your army of zombies, or quarter of the army of zombies, or third of the army of zombies, and the rest of it proper vampire counts units. It's gonna make your campaign a lot better, but at the same time, then the question is asked, why are you playing Ghorst if you're just going to play a generic legendary lord of the vampire counts like Kemler, Vlad, Isabella, Manfred even? Yeah, I can't believe I'm praising Manfred, but all of them have much better campaigns at the end of the day if you're going with that. Like, Ghorst's specialty is focusing on zombies, but focusing on zombies leads to a dreadful playstyle, leads to a dreadful campaign. Powerful campaign, really powerful legendary lord. Don't mistake what I'm saying here for the sentiment that, oh, he's weak. No, he's not weak. He's incredibly powerful, because the reason he's so incredibly powerful is, imagine you're playing a faction on legendary difficulty where the AI gets significant bonuses, and you can flat out outnumber them 10 to 1. That's the kind of situation you can have as Ghorst, because you can lower the upkeep of zombies. You can lower the cost of zombies, you can lower the upkeep of zombies. You do have some significant benefits when it comes to it. Like, you can lower the upkeep by 25% for Ghorst's army for zombies. Then you have research that can lower the upkeep of zombies even further by 35%. So you can have zombies dirt cheap. Imagine you have an army that can outnumber the Skaven in the campaign, or a faction where you can literally outnumber any other faction or numerous factions put together from the very start of your campaign. That's something that the vampire counts can do pretty quickly, but Ghorst just does it way better. I guess the only saving grace of this campaign is that you can be in a position, though you won't be, especially not on a high difficulty. You can be in a position where you bring like 4 armies to a fight, and while you will still suffer significant casualties, you'll at least win the fight without having to out-resolve it. And that's where the casualty replenishment plays a good role in that. But not a great campaign to play, not a fun campaign to play. Powerful, but pretty boring. The final campaign for me to talk about in this video is, of course, Lord Mazdamundi of the Lizardmen. This campaign has a lot of bad things going for it. So it is difficult early on. Like, you have a Keeper of Secrets to deal with from the first battle of your campaign. That can be a bit of a challenge when you're dealing with a campaign starting situation. And that's the Keeper of Secrets, by the way. So that's a really rough starting position. Like, you have Skeggy, you have to deal with Slaanesh. And then, of course, you have Morathi as a northern neighbor, and you can't really expand in her territory because lizardmen don't really like frozen climate. I can't imagine why. But here's the problem with this campaign, in a nutshell. So, your starting situation with Slaanesh and then with Skeggy is a rough starting campaign situation. That's the beginning of it, however. Once you deal with these, and yes, there are some difficult early game battles to be fought here, especially against Skeggy or against that Keeper of Secrets. Like, you can throw a lot of Saurus at this thing. But once you deal with that, you don't really have a lot going for it. You do start with a non-aggression pact with Morathi, so you don't really have to worry too much about your northern flank. Or you can take some territory and take it over. Like, you could go to war with Morathi just to get good relations with the High Elves. But Haxoatl is just in a really bad campaign situation, because once you deal with those 2 initial threats, the Imperials and the Savage Orcs are not going to be able to stand up to your armies, especially not armies that have just finished dealing with the Keeper of Secrets and the Norskans and heavily fortified settlements with really powerful garrisons in Skeggy over here. So that campaign starting situation is not conducive towards a great campaign. Having a campaign that's brutally difficult for the first few turns but then doesn't have anything on offer beyond that is not particularly great. Like, yeah, you could go have the fun of conquering Wolf One, but you're not really going to encounter any other challenge in your campaign. Even if you do decide, oh, I'm going to take over all of Lustria, there's not really going to be much on offer when it comes to that. So it's a limited campaign from that perspective. It's not fun, it's not enjoyable from the perspective of that situation. Beyond that, however, Pepe the Frog, who is hated by every other faction because he apparently wants to genocide all of them. That's the meme surrounding Mazdamundi. So diplomatic relations are going to be difficult to achieve later on in the campaign. But beyond that, Mazdamundi just doesn't really have a great playstyle. I mean, he does get an upkeep benefit, and look at him, he's the sleeping frog right there. He gets an upkeep benefit to Temple Guard units. He has some casting benefits, of course, as well, because he is a pretty powerful caster. But the thing is, it's not really a great playstyle. It's not a unique playstyle. I mean, there's always generic legendary lords for every race. Like, Tyrion is the generic legendary lord for the High Elves. Mazdamundi is for the Lizardmen. The problem is the High Elves can be very interesting to play even on a generic level. The Lizardmen are not. I mean, yeah, you know, Tic-Tac-Toe with his dive bombers, or Oxyotl with his skirmisher infantry, that can be fun. Or Krokar just nuking everything out of existence from the very beginning of his campaign. All of those can lead to interesting campaigns, but just the generic playstyle of, oh, I have Saurus, I'm going to use Saurus, is not a great playstyle, and I think it really drags it down. And I think Mazdamundi certainly has one of the least interesting campaigns to play at the moment. I just don't think the Lizardmen are really an interesting race to play at the moment. Like, if you want to talk, oh, they have dinosaurs and all that, yeah, but there's better legendary lords for that particular playstyle, like Rockgar, Gorok, all that. Like, there's a lot of better legendary lords. There's a lot of better campaigns, even in Lustria, that you have available, like Gorok over here. I actually confused that for Krokar earlier. Yeah, but Gorok starts with Lord Croak. There can be interesting Lizardmen campaign. There are interesting Lizardmen campaigns, but Mazdamundi just doesn't make the cut. It's not really a long explanation. He just doesn't have an interesting campaign at the end of the day. And that's all there is to say. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.